Tsushima, Japan, 1274. The islands of Tsushima and Miki are part of Mongolian Empire, Kublai Khan's first steps towards taking the mainland of Japan. These small islands near the mainland held very few people and warriors. Tsushima, being so small, held a force of 80 samurai warriors, who bravely faced an enemy force of 1,000 to 8,000 men. These warriors knew they were facing death itself. They knew Tsushima was their last stand, and that they were merely sacrificing themselves in an effort to slow the massive invasion. With this, they threw themselves courageously into a losing battle. Ghost of Tsushima places you at the Battle of Tsushima Island as one of the samurai riding into their imminent death, Jin Sakai. Although Jin Sakai was not a real person and his story is fictional, his character and world are based in non-fiction. The life he lives in-game is not a far-fetched life of the real-world samurai. Many of his traits, as well as his uncle's, Lord Shimura, are indicative of the way real-world samurai lived during this time. The way this is achieved is just one example of why this game is brilliant. And let me say that again, this game is brilliant. From the in-game world design, to the combat system, to the story, which will all be covered, but more importantly, what this game did for me personally. But first and foremost, the world design. The island is split into three main components, with the player starting at the very south of the island, the bottom of it. Each third of the island is discoverable and able to be traversed with each act of the game's story, meaning Act 1 allows you in 1/3 of the map, Act 2 lets you in 2/3, and Act 3 gives you full range to travel the island. The player mainly traverses the island on horseback, although going on foot is an option. Throughout the island, the player will cross beautiful fields of flowers and traverse through dense forests with a sense of foreboding, expecting to be attacked by bandits, Mongols, or Ronin at any time. Settlements, survivor camps, outposts, temples, and more populate the island for the player to discover. The way the game leads the player to these landmarks is masterful and something totally new that I've experienced in the game. The player could just be walking along a path or crossing a field on their horse when suddenly they come upon a fox den, or a golden bird appears in their peripheral vision. These animals naturally draw the player towards them, seeming to lead them somewhere, and they can be followed to find undiscovered locations like a shrine, or they can be followed to find items, such as apparel. I love how natural the game pushes the player in a direction to discover something they haven't yet, which is reflected in combat encounters as well. As mentioned before, the game really provides the player with a sense of impending doom when traveling an area, with the expectation to come across the corpses of innocents and groups of enemies at any moment, and the player will encounter these enemies, which after defeating, sometimes a hostage that's being held can be freed. After releasing the hostage, they will mention a place on the map in which a large force of Mongols, Ronin, or bandits established themselves and have been harming innocents. The way the game pulls this off adds to the seamlessness of traversing the island and learning of these landmarks. Past this, the world design is the most gorgeous aspect of this game. The scenery is unmatched, being the most beautiful game I've ever seen, and the game is self-aware of its beauty, with objectives like Inari Shrines to discover and haikus to write, which not only fit the world and story tonally, but also act as a drive to get the player to explore and see how beautiful the island is. Moreover, each landmark the player encounters reflect the real-world building and town designs of 13th century Japan, even down to the trebuchets used by the Mongols in-game, which were actually used in multiple real-world Mongol sieges during this time. To further enhance the world design, the game developers even went as far as to go to Japan and take scans of leaves, flowers, grass, and other plants to truly replicate the beauty of Japan's nature. The design of the island is the most historically accurate part of the game, depicting what the island of Tsushima most likely looked like during ancient Japan. Although the design of the island itself is pretty historically accurate, there are some design aspects that aren't, which were likely added for gameplay purposes and an overall enjoyment factor. While I am able to appreciate the historical accuracy of the game, just because the game has some historical inconsistencies does not detract from the overall enjoyment. In fact, most of these historical inconsistencies are added to make the game more enjoyable, as mentioned before. For example, the katana with its signature curved blade, known as the samurai's weapon of choice, was actually not during this era. In fact, the curved katanas we love and know were not used in samurai combat until 15th century Japan, 200 years later. Although samurai did not use the curved katana this early in Japan's history, they did have swords, at this time called chokuta, or tachi, which were longer and thinner than the more modern Japanese katana. Likely because of their long and thin nature, they would often chip or break against the Mongols' boiled leather armor. Even still, it was uncommon for every samurai to carry one of these swords. Samurai at this time would often choose the naginata, a long wooden pole with a curved blade, which ironically can be seen in the hands of the spearmen enemies in the game. Past the chokuta and naginata, there was one weapon almost all samurai used at this time, which was the bow, or yumi. The samurai were well versed in archery on foot and on horseback at this time, as they believed that death from afar was the most effective way of taking out the opponent. And of course, we are provided our own bow in the game. As stated before, even though the game does have some historical inaccuracies, these don't detract from the experience of the game in any way, which is something to keep in mind when I cover the combat, gameplay, and the story of Jin, which are, for the most part, not completely historically accurate for this era of Japan. There are two main aspects of combat in the game: stealth combat and close-up and personal fighting, where the player faces their opponents face-to-face. I'll refer to this as honorable combat. These two approaches to combat are actually important narrative-wise, as a large portion of the story centers around Jin's personal struggle to follow the samurai code of Bushido, which is facing your opponent head-on with honor and respect. He struggles with following the code due to an extreme outnumbering and disadvantage in the fight, and this leads him to take more stealthy, dirty options. I will cover this further in the story section, but it is important to note for now. The first approach to combat the player learns is the honorable way. Honorable combat throws away stealth and focuses on approaching the enemies head-on. The game encourages this type of combat with a feature called Standoff, in which Jin can call out to a group of enemies and tell them to face him when the player is given the prompt. With this, Jin will go into a standoff position and cut down each enemy that faces him, one at a time. There is a sense of rhythm in this honorable combat that is especially sensed in standoffs, as the player must react to the enemies, waiting for them to attack before countering. This goes beyond the standoffs though, as the player is constantly waiting to react to the enemy with a block, a parry, or a dodge in face-to-face encounters instead of just running in and swinging wildly. Playing like that is punished heavily in this game, ensuring Jin's imminent death. This rhythm system of waiting for an enemy to attack to then counter and attack yourself is fairly deep and commands much accuracy and dexterity. Each enemy has different kinds of attacks that vary in strength, each having a small window to be either blocked, parried, or dodged as mentioned before. An enemy's regular attack, in which a glow is not present, can be blocked, parried, and dodged to avoid it, and they are the easiest attacks to avoid. An enemy's heavier attack will present a blue glow, meaning the attack cannot be blocked, only parried or dodged. Finally, an enemy's heaviest attack will flash a red glow, and these attacks cannot be blocked or parried, only dodged. On top of this, enemies have a guard which is represented as a white line above their head. The player must use guard breaking attacks to lower the white line until it's gone, allowing health damage to be dealt. This variety of attack strength and the guard system is consistent with all types of enemies besides archers, who have a slightly different form of these systems. Firstly, archers have no guard and can be cut down in one slice. As for the varying attack strengths, they will either shoot regular arrows or fire arrows. Regular arrows can be blocked by Jin's blade, but fire arrows must be dodged. If not, Jin is promptly set on fire and will be until the player rolls or goes into water. As mentioned before, there are archers, as well as 4 other main types of enemies: swordsmen, shieldmen, spearmen, and brutes. With each type of enemy comes a different approach to defeating them with your blade. To do this, the player must switch between 4 sword stances unlocked throughout the course of the game. These stances being the stone stance, the most effective for swordsmen, the water stance, most effective for shieldmen, the wind stance, which is most effective for spearmen, and the moon stance, which is most effective for brutes. The player will have to face all of these types of enemies with every group they come across, which forces the player to change stances on the fly. This adds more depth and difficulty to the combat, making it all more satisfying to master it throughout the course of the game. There is one more main aspect to the honorable style of combat, which are duels. There are multiple duels that the player encounters throughout the game, many of them serving as boss battles. These duels are fought primarily in one stance during the battle, so they don't bring a challenge to the constant stance changing mechanic like in regular head-on combat, but they do heavily challenge the block, parry, dodge system. Most of the enemies Jin duels throughout the game are the strongest Mongol captains and Ronin swordsmen, who have much more challenging and unique movesets compared to regular enemies. These movesets come with a tighter window to block, parry, and dodge. This, on top of the opponent having more health and an unbreakable guard compared to regular enemies, really do make these duels a challenge. Some duels I would be able to beat in a couple tries, maybe 3 or 4, while some other duels have taken me upwards of 20 attempts before beating them. Beating a particularly hard opponent brought immense amounts of satisfaction, and provides this sense of improvement with every victory. Moving on, the other style of combat the player will often use in this game is stealth combat. Stealth combat consists of staying out of the enemy's view and sneaking around from enemy to enemy, taking them out quickly and silently. When Jin sneaks up to an enemy unspotted, the player is given a prompt to assassinate, in which doing so, Jin will use his short blade or tanto to kill the enemy in one strike. This is the most common way of assassinating an enemy, but Jin can assassinate from above as well, jumping from a great height and stabbing his katana into the top of an enemy. The last type of assassination open to the player is the shoji assassination, in which Jin stabs the back of an enemy through a door, killing him instantly. To get from enemy to enemy, the player is encouraged to use the environment around them to aid in their stealth, combat, and traversal of a camp. Using the environment is somewhat mandatory by the end of the game, which the player should be seasoned at by then. Spotting places to grapple on roofs, or shooting a hanging lantern with an arrow onto some enemies below will become tricks of the trade in stealth combat, as well as assassinations. With this, there are certain weapons and items that aid in stealth sections called ghost weapons, which are open to Jin's arsenal throughout the course of the game. While these ghost weapons can be used during both stealth sections and honorable combat, I did find myself using them much more during stealth. For instance, wind chimes and firecrackers are useful for distracting enemies, and black powder bombs are good for stunning a group of enemies. The half bow and longbow are useful for picking off lone enemies from a distance, and the blowgun can be used to shoot poison and hallucinogenic darts. Smoke bombs are good for going back into cover when spotted, and kunai are helpful in taking out large groups of enemies quickly without alerting the whole camp. This style of stealth combat is opened up to the player shortly after learning about honorable combat. Jin learns about tactics of stealth from a thief named Yuna, who appears much throughout the game. While I'll save the story of Jin, Yuna, and other characters for the story section, the combat and story go hand in hand together, with the idea that the player can somewhat roleplay and choose to either play stealthily or honorably. The player has the choice to act as the kind of ghost they want to be. While the way the player approaches combat doesn't change the overall story beats, the player can see reflections of their actions in the world. For instance, when the player primarily focuses on stealth combat, the weather of the island will become stormy and thundering. This is reflective of the real world history behind the invasion, in which a terrible storm, theorized to have been a tsunami or typhoon, drove away the Mongols on two occasions. Many Mongol ships sank due to this storm, and the Mongol army lost many men at sea. On the opposite end of that spectrum, when the player focuses on honorable combat, the weather is more beautiful and tranquil. Although the story will play out the same regardless of how honorable or how ghostly the player plays, there are still some reflections of your choices on the island. Ghost of Tsushima, the story. After the battle at Komoda Beach in the beginning of the game, the general narrative of the game is Jin Sakai avenging the massacre of Tsushima's samurai and driving the Mongols off the island of Tsushima. What makes this a perfect story for this type of open world gameplay is how general the story is. Games that have open world gameplay but a more narrow, focused story suffer from chore work. This has been a common theme in many modern open world games, where the player will have a narrow goal to reach, and most of the side content will not relate to this goal in any way. And this causes a huge disconnect between the player doing the gameplay and the player following the story. Ghost of Tsushima expertly avoids this with its open ended narrative. So, whenever the player chooses to do side content, they don't feel like they're stagnating the main goal in any way, and are in fact moving it forward. Even though all of this side content is technically skippable, the player is drawn to complete it. Every time I would come across an optional Mongol camp, I would either take care of it there and then or tell myself to go back to it later, which I always did. With each one I completed, I felt like I was slowly taking the island of Tsushima back from control of the Mongols, even though it isn't necessary to complete the main story. Many of these side quests reflect what Jin does in the main objectives, which makes many of these side quests not even feel like side content, but instead a supplement to the main objective. Many of the things Jin does in both side and main content include taking back territory stolen from the Mongols, destroying Mongol supplies, to defeating the Mongol generals, and recruiting the help of many different useful individuals. The player will naturally encounter these individuals while exploring the island and completing objectives. All of them have their own personal, compelling stories and goals. The stories of these characters reflect many of the real lives Japanese people lived during this invasion and the tragedy of war. As mentioned before, Yuna the thief is one of these individuals that the player will encounter, as well as her brother Taka, a blacksmith. After Jin encounters Yuna and sees how valuable she can be to the war effort, he offers an exchange. Jin recruits Yuna's help to take back the island, with the exchange that he will help her in her efforts first. Yuna's goal is to find safe passage to the mainland with her brother Taka and start a new life away from war, bandits, and Ronin, which Jin is able to help provide through the power of his uncle, Lord Shimura, who can grant that safe passage. Before this can happen, though, Jin needs help in saving Lord Shimura, who is taken captive after the battle at Kamada Beach. Yuna agrees to help him do so, with this I scratch your back, you scratch mine relationship. This relationship is seen in most of these types of individuals the player encounters, and move forward both Jin's story and goals, as well as the people he decides to help. Lady Masako, Sensei Ishikawa, Norio, the last warrior monk, and Ryuzo, leader of the Straw Hats, are more of these individuals that Jin shares this type of relationship with. Lady Masako, a wife and mother to samurai who died at Kamada Beach, and a warrior in her own right, receives help from Jin to avenge the death of her family. With this, she promises to help Jin take down the Khan when the time comes. Sensei Ishikawa, known as the most talented archer on the island, recruits Jin's help to stop his most skilled student, Tomoe, who took her gifted archery and betrayed her people, joining the side of the Mongols. With this, he also agrees to ride into battle with Jin in due course. Norio, a warrior monk, the last of his kind, wants to take back the temples captured by the Mongols and protect them, believing that if the temples are lost, the people will lose hope. Not only this, his brother was tasked with protecting a certain statue at a temple and fell in battle to an overwhelming force of Mongols, who then stole the statue. With this, Norio is given a will to avenge his brother and reclaim hope for the people of Tsushima, who believe he is unable to protect their temples the way his brother was unable to. Jin aids him in his quest, with Norio exchanging his word to fight alongside Jin against the Khan. Finally, the last individual I want to mention Jin's relationship with is Ryuzo, leader of the Straw Hats. Ryuzo is an old childhood friend of Jin's, and a rival he competed with growing up, as both are talented, skilled swordsmen. When they meet again in adulthood during the invasion, Ryuzo and Jin catch up on some things, and Jin soon learns that Ryuzo's men are starving and have been unlucky finding food on the Mongols they kill. Jin, wanting to help his old friend and possibly receive his friend's help in return in a battle against the Khan, agrees to help Ryuzo take out a large encampment of Mongols and take their food. Unfortunately, they return empty-handed and continue to make attempts to take the Mongols' food, which turn out more discouraging than the last. Eventually, Ryuzo and his men are captured by the Mongols, but when Jin comes to save them, he soon learns that Ryuzo and the Straw Hats like being with the Mongols. They say the Mongols have given them food, wine, and comfort, and that they do not want to leave. With this, the Mongols sow the seeds of betrayal between Ryuzo and Jin. Jin explains how they will just be used for war, and Ryuzo argues that he and his men will have to fight regardless of whose side they're on, so they will take the side with more comfort. Jin is forced to leave Ryuzo and his men there, and starts to accept that he might have to kill the Straw Hats, maybe even Ryuzo. This comes into reality when Ryuzo is ordered by the Khan leader to kill Jin, and eventually, the two find themselves having a duel. With this, Jin is forced to kill his childhood best friend, showing that despite his best efforts, sometimes he just can't win against the Mongols. The relationship Jin creates and holds with these people are what make the story so compelling. As previously stated, the overarching goal of the story is general: push the Mongols out of Tsushima. And this is effective for keeping the player engaged gameplay-wise, but could be perceived as boring narrative-wise. The way Ghost of Tsushima avoids that issue is by having many of these smaller, more intricate stories within the main objective of the narrative. With this, the game is allowed to have a broad story to keep player engagement in both side and main content, while also having a compelling and intricate narrative apart from the gameplay. Now, I'd like to talk about what this game did for me personally. Why would I be willing to create a documentary about this game? And what exactly did it do for me that I would find it this interesting? Well, I truthfully don't play video games on my own much more. When I was younger, that was probably my biggest hobby, and consistently I would become lost in the world of many games. But eventually, I started having less and less time for this hobby. Growing up, holding more responsibilities, and spending more time with friends has stagnated my love for this hobby, and for years now, I felt like those feelings I had as a kid playing a game I love were gone. Although those feelings were no longer there, I've still been playing video games casually, only ever when I have friends over, as I just received no more enjoyment from single player experiences. But that love for this hobby was rekindled when I put Ghost of Tsushima in my console and started playing. Every aspect about this game is something I'm appealed to, even if I can't quite put my finger on all of it. I hope that others may understand why not only me, but many people love this hobby and what finding the right hobby can do for someone. I encourage everyone to find their Ghost of Tsushima. It doesn't have to be a video game, but any piece of media or hobby of your choice that truly makes you appreciate the feelings of happiness and stress release loving it provides. Thank you.